Do details that emerge in the lawsuit filed by the families of the victims in the Idaho 4 murders against WSU Pullman shed new light that we didn't know about before? How strong is their argument? Today, I'm going to look at that legal document, that 126-page legal document filed by the families that was filed on January 7th, 2026. We already have a response from WSU. That's coming in a later video. But the devil's in the details. Let's break down this document. How good is the argument of the families of the victims of the Idaho 4? Are we all being assholes because we didn't know the full story? Let's get into it today. Devil's in the details. All right, now what I'm going to do today is I'm going to break down the legal document, and some of it's very, very repetitive. I'll tell you that right now. By the way, if you like legal documents and you like breakdowns and you like an honest opinion, that's what this is going to be, an honest opinion. Many people think that I'm just a Kohberger or whatever, that I just want guilty people to walk free. That is not the case. And if you don't know that, or if you don't understand my channel, you need to be paying better attention. At the end of the day, I have no dog in the fight on whether or not Kohberger is guilty or isn't guilty. And I know you're saying he is guilty, he pled guilty, but that's still up for debate as we move towards the civil penalty of this case. So as we move to the civil case, which again starts here with the Goncalves family et al., and it's not really the Goncalves family, it really is more the Chapin family legally filing this lawsuit against WSU Pullman, because they're the only family that actually resides in Washington State. We'll get into that in detail here as well. We're going to go through that legal document and look at their argument and try to be completely fair about it. Do they provide new details that we didn't know during the criminal investigation into Bryan Kohberger that would make a difference in the court of public opinion? And will it make a difference in this lawsuit? Let's break it down. And again, if you like this kind of stuff, like and subscribe immediately, because we do a lot of really, really big stuff here. And we have attorneys that talk about this, and I'll give their opinions on it as well. So I try to be fair on both sides. So let's give the families a due shot on their argument. And again, no cynicism. Let's see how strong it is. It's way stronger, I think, than people think. So let's take a look at it. So on the screen is our e-filed Skagit County Clerk, Skagit County, Washington, January 7th, 2026. This lawsuit against WSU was filed in Skagit County because one of the family members, the Chapins, resided in Washington State. The rest did not. So as it needed to come forward from a Washington State resident to file a lawsuit against a Washington State entity, the WSU, Washington State University, WSU. And so that family in Washington filed it on behalf of all the families. That's why it started in Skagit County. And if you haven't been following, you'll know that they've already requested to move it out of Skagit County, even though they said in this document that we're going to read, this is the appropriate court for it. They actually have requested to move it to the east side of the state. Skagit County is on the west side of the state. Pullman, Washington, is on the east side of the state. Everybody that's involved in this case is on the east side of the state. And so after the lawsuit was filed in Skagit County, where one of the family members resided, they decided to request to move it to the east side of the state so it would make it easier for everybody to appear. That makes total sense, but let's get into the details now. Now, you've got Steve Goncalves, you've got Karen Laramie, Jeffrey Kernodle, you've got Stacy Chapman as representatives of the families. There's a lot of complaints here and a lot of meat. A lot of this is very repetitious, so I'm going to try to avoid the repetition, but it's impossible. A lot of these documents give a summary of what they're going to argue, then they argue it, and then they conclude what they argued, and you get to hear it 3 times, and it gets very, very lengthy. And I'm trying to avoid that, but the devil is in the details, and sometimes a sentence gets changed from the summary to the actual details to the conclusion. And so when those things happen, sometimes it's necessary to read it verbatim. Now, this is the plaintiffs bring causes of action against the defendant, Washington State University, and allege the following. Now, again, for those who don't understand, what's happening is now that Bryan Kohberger has been criminally convicted, if you will, via a plea deal that I did these murders and I did them alone. Now the families are suing Washington State University, who brought Bryan Kohberger from Pennsylvania out to Pullman, Washington to go to school, and had a duty to stop him from doing what he did. That's the gist of it. You had a duty to stop Bryan Kohberger from doing what he did, and you didn't. Therefore, we're suing you for $500 million, $400 and something million in the lawsuit. And that's the gist. That's the high level summary. You should have stopped this. You should have seen this coming. Any reasonable person would have saw this coming, and you didn't stop it. Therefore, it's your fault, and you've got the deep pocketbooks, so pay up. That's kind of the gist of it. I said I was going to be fair to the families, and it doesn't sound like I'm being fair to the families to start off, but I will be fair to the families. So let's get into this. This case arises out of the violent assault and murder of 4 University of Idaho students by Washington State University employee with a known history of threatening, stalking, and predatory behavior. Yes, Bryan Kohberger was not just a student in the PhD candidate program of WSU for criminology, but is also technically an employee of the university. So we're going to get into that detail and that nuance. WSU brought Bryan Kohberger to Pullman, Washington in the Pacific Northwest to serve as a teaching assistant in the Criminal Justice and Criminology Department, which is a paid position. So that's part of the employee thing, right? It's an unpaid position. He gets money for doing this job like a teacher, and he gets paid, and that helps offset his cost of his schooling, but it's technically a paid employee. That's why they're saying it's an employee of WSU. So, while he also worked to obtain his PhD with a study focused on sexually motivated burglars and serial killers. Now, stop right there. This is information not everybody has caught. They're saying not only was Bryan Kohberger going into criminology, a PhD candidate in criminology, but he was specifically specializing in sexually motivated burglaries and serial killings. And so therefore, they're going to argue in the document, this is exactly his thing. It's what he likes. He likes serial killers and burglaries and understanding how that works. And again, I said I was going to be fair to the families, and it sounds like I'm not going to be. Trust me, many things that the family's lawyer put forward are strong arguments. We're going to cover that and how strong it really is. So if you're looking for me to only present one side, even though it kind of sounds like I am going to lean towards showing you they've got a much better argument than it looked like on the surface for many people. But we'll break it down in details. But that's what they're arguing. Look, he didn't just come here to study criminology. He came here specifically to study serial killers and burglars, sexually motivated. Now, the reason I'm making a big deal out of this is we've been told by the prosecution many times. I want to make it absolutely abundantly clear. Bill Thompson said this. I want to make it clear. There is no sexual motivation for these crimes. Bill Thompson said that multiple times. Steve Goncalves, one of the families suing WSU, has stated repeatedly in the papers that there was a sexual motivation. So who are we to believe? The families of the victims who keep saying through Steve Goncalves that it was sexually motivated and Bryan Kohberger was studying sexual motivated murders. So therefore, that's how you tie them together. Or the prosecution, who is actually going to prosecute Bryan Kohberger and said, I want to make it abundantly clear, there's no sexual motivation in this crime whatsoever. So that's, again, devil's in the details. This argument is going to say, yes, these crimes were sexually motivated, even though the prosecution told you it wasn't sexually motivated. Kohberger was heavily reliant on WSU, who paid him a salary, provided him free on-campus housing, medical benefits, free tuition, all conditioned on his behavior and subject to being revoked. Their big argument is, at any time, Bryan Kohberger, if he wasn't behaving well, could have had his funding pulled and he wouldn't have been able to go to school there anymore. And therefore, they had control and power over him and therefore had every ability to control his behavior. That is the gist of this argument. You, WSU, could have stopped Bryan Kohberger from doing what he's doing because you could have cut off his funding and he wouldn't have been able to carry out these things because he wouldn't have been able to continue going to school there if you had caught the fact that he was a sexual predator on the prowl. If you had seen it like everybody else should have seen, you would have stopped him and you had the power to do so. That's the gist of this lawsuit. Point 3. Almost immediately upon his arrival to the Pullman, Moscow community, Kohberger developed a reputation for discriminatory, harassing, and stalking behavior, instilling substantial fear among young female students and fellow WSU employees, necessitating regular security escorts for multiple females. Despite receiving at least 13 formal reports of Kohberger's inappropriate, predatory, and menacing behavior, WSU failed to respond in any meaningful way and allowed Kohberger's escalating behavior to continue unchecked. That is a big paragraph and very powerful for the families, because let me explain it. Now, first of all, let's step back for a second. The prosecution stated over and over again in Bryan Kohberger's criminal case, there is no evidence of stalking whatsoever. Yet the family's coming forward and said Bryan Kohberger was a stalker. Here's the devil's in the details. They're not allegedly saying Bryan Kohberger was stalking the girls at 1122 King Road residence. That's not what they're saying necessarily. What they're saying is Kohberger was stalking females, not necessarily the victims in this case. So therefore, these two things can be congruent. You understand? So the prosecutors will say there's no evidence Kohberger was stalking the girls at 1122 King Road residence in Moscow. And they also, the families can simultaneously say, yes, he was a stalker, even though he may not have been stalking those girls, he was stalking girls. And this is something WSU knew, that Kohberger was stalking girls. So the big meat of it is, can they prove any of this? They state, for example, that WSU employees required security escorts. If that can be proven, it's huge on the family. That there were 13 formal reports of Kohberger's inappropriate predatory behavior. If that's the case, again, strong for the family. Recorded people saying, I'm so afraid of Kohberger's stalking behavior, that's what they're going to say, that I need an escort to my car because I'm afraid of him. And there's been 13 formal reports against him. So this is where they're laying out the really, really strong case about WSU should have seen this coming and didn't. So those are things they have to be able to prove, right? All right. Point 4. On November 13th, 2022, a foreseeable, now this is not the murders, on November 13th, a foreseeable and in fact predictable tragedy occurred when Kohberger entered the bedrooms of 4 undergraduate students and violently stabbed them to death. These deaths should not and would not have occurred if WSU had acted appropriately. This, in my opinion, is going to be an extremely hard sell, and it's basically the gist of WSU's response. There's no way anybody could have foreseen this coming. They're saying you absolutely should have seen it coming. You could have predicted this. It is totally predictable, and you should have saw it coming, and you should have stopped it. Therefore, it is your fault. I personally think super hard fucking sell, but that's what this entire document is. Any reasonable person would have seen this coming. You didn't. You could have stopped it. If I were in your position, I would have stopped it. Therefore, I'm suing you because you didn't stop what was totally, that's what they said, totally foreseeable and in fact predictable. You should have saw it coming. That's the gist. And that part I disagree with on their part. But let's hear them out because it's got some good points. Point 5, after Kohberger pled guilty in July 2025 for 4 counts of first-degree murder and burglary, various law enforcement agencies began releasing files from their investigations. Now, this is big. Again, the public was largely held in the dark about anything about this case. It was unprecedented gag orders on this case. We didn't get to see shit. And now only after a plea deal in the criminal case do we start to see stuff, including the families of the victims, when they start seeing things that we all were hidden from or all misled about from the very beginning, including the very families. Those files, they continue, together with other information in the public domain, paint a deeply disturbing picture of the breathtaking level of organizational paralysis and inaction by WSU that enabled Kohberger over a period of months to stalk his victims and plan and commit these heinous murders. Now, again, here's the uphill battle, in my opinion, about the families. They repeatedly stated, the prosecution repeatedly stated, there is no evidence Bryan Kohberger stalked any of the victims. Yet, their attorneys for the families are saying, absolutely, Bryan Kohberger was stalking the victims. At first, they started out a little bit more nuanced. Bryan Kohberger has patterns of stalking females, not necessarily at 1122 King. And again, I said those were not incongruent. They never said stalking the girls at 112. Now, point 5, they're starting to say, yeah, he was stalking the girls of this particular crime. Not true, according to the prosecution. So who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the families, or are you going to believe the actual prosecution and law enforcement? Well, civil trials have different rules about evidence, so we'll see. But that's what they're arguing. Now, point 6, before WSU brought Kohberger to Pullman, Moscow community, he had a history of heroin addiction and been arrested for theft and made numerous posts over a period of years on public online forums commenting about his inability to feel emotion and having crazy thoughts. Now, full stop. Bryan Kohberger's heroin addiction when it was in his teens, long time ago, and he has a history of having broken the addiction a long time ago. He used to be a chubby kid. He lost a ton of weight. He became very healthy. He became obsessed about exercise, and he took care of himself, and he ate clean, and he ate all, like, he changed everything about him. So bringing back his heroin addiction from his teen years as evidence that this guy's a drug addict and whatever is a little disingenuous, but that's what they're trying to point. And back when he was into drugs in a teen year period, he stole his sister's phone, and to teach him a lesson and try to get him to straighten up and fly right, as I understand it, his own family turned him in for stealing his sister's phone and basically gave him consequences. Like, this is a wake-up call. You can't do this shit. Don't go down this path. And he did correct his behavior, and he became a good model citizen by what we see externally, all through how the fact that he changed his diet, he changed his habits, became fit, he went to school, he became disciplined, he got accepted into a PhD program. He had turned his life around. Yet the victims of the family are going to say, no, he's a criminal. He's a drug addict and a thief, and had a history of this from way back when he was a teenager, before he corrected all those behaviors. So it's a little disingenuous in my point. But they're going to make a good point with this crazy emotional thoughts. Let's get into that. He had been removed from a vocational program in high school because of problems with women. And later, local business owners had become so alarmed at his behavior towards young women that staff kept electronic notes about him to warn female staff when he arrived. He also had pursued a graduate degree in criminology, where he demonstrated particular fascination with serial killers. All right, there's multiple points there. All right, sorry about that. I got a phone call right in the middle of that recording, so I had to stop abruptly. Hopefully I can fix this in editing. So continuing on, here's the thing. If this particular point 6 that I think we're on, is true, then staff kept electronic notes about warning them about Bryan Kohberger. And if that's the case, again, it's big for the families if that has been documented. And the fact that he was interested in serial killers, probably a no, never mind, but it's just something to add teeth. I want to continue on with their document and try to get through this before I get another phone call. I got all kinds of shit going on you wouldn't believe. Point 7, almost immediately upon Kohberger's arrival to the Pullman, Moscow community, he began demonstrating antisocial, disturbing, and menacing behaviors. In August of 2022, early in the semester, a fellow graduate student began leaving her office door open because she believed this guy was going to do something inappropriate with a student, and said that Kohberger struck her as a stalker or sexual assaulter type. And again, these kind of details, some of which we've heard before in the upcoming, the ongoing criminal trial that's now over, if they can prove it, will help their case tremendously, if they can prove it. And so the question is, if they put it in this legal document, does that mean they've got somebody on the record who will say that's what happened? Based on how Kohberger talked to and treated women, another fellow graduate student described him as a possible future rapist. Again, if they've got that person on the record as saying that, that's going to carry some weight. And Kohberger's supervising instructor was aware that several female graduate students had reported that they were very uncomfortable with interactions they had with him. Female graduate students also complained that he made them feel unsafe. He was noted to be obsessed with studying sexually motivated burglaries and serial killers. So again, if it's all documented that people were feeling uncomfortable with Kohberger, this will go well for them in that discussion. Point 8, on multiple occasions and with multiple WSU female staff members and fellow students, Kohberger would regularly stand close to their desk, loom over them, and would block their exits from on-campus offices for long periods of time. One female graduate student reported that Kohberger would trap her in her office and try to talk to her about the Ted Bundy murders. Now, I want to stop for a minute. Again, we know, and they acknowledge in this document, that Bryan Kohberger had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And so this disorder tends to have people that present differently than the rest of us. And they might not understand people's personal boundaries and standing too close. So people just claiming, hey, he stood close to me, means really nothing whatsoever. Now, if it was reported that people were feeling uncomfortable and unsafe because of those behaviors, the fact that they reported that would be important. So again, let me clarify. That he stood close to people is not a big deal, and that may just be a condition of his condition. But if they reported it to officials that made them uncomfortable and that wasn't recorded, that could be a problem. Or if it was recorded and not acted on, that could be a problem. And that's the gist of what their argument is. Those kind of uncomfortable situations were reported and not acted on. Therefore, they could have stopped this, is what the argument is. Kohberger also, they said, followed several female students and staff to their cars after hours. Multiple female students and staff members were so uncomfortable with Kohberger's behavior that security escorts were arranged for them after 5 p.m. Escorts that in some instances were provided by professors and in other instances by WSU Police Department. That is enormous for the families. If Bryan Kohberger was such an intimidating factor for females on campus that WSU police officers would escort women to their car to avoid interactions with Kohberger. And again, if that was known to be going on and they did nothing about it, that would be a strong case for the family that you kind of saw this behavior going on and did nothing to curb it. So again, all of that is predicated on, can they prove it that that is what truly happened? And if so, strong case for them. That the university had some complicity and not doing something further. Now, the part again, whether or not they can predict that the crime is going to happen, that's a whole nother thing. Certain of these staff members told others that Kohberger had been stalking them. Certain of these staff members told others that Kohberger had been stalking them. So again, their claim that Kohberger was a stalker and a known stalker, not necessarily the girls at 1122 King, but in general, stalking-like behavior. And if it's documented and they did nothing, then that is the basis of their legal argument, and it's fairly strong. Number 9, some graduate students reported that they kept their on-campus doors shut in an effort to keep Kohberger out, while others left their doors open as a place of refuge for others if they felt threatened by Kohberger. In one instance, early in September, Kohberger so verbally attacked a female student in the classroom that she fled in tears, leaving all of her belongings behind. Kohberger was described as very angry, as if he had built up a fury or rage. Now, this incident will be repeated later in the document and with more specificity. There you go. Okay, so we may have to read this again if we have time, but we'll get back to that in a minute. So again, all of this, if it's documented, is good, strong case for the families who are saying, look, you knew you had a problem with Kohberger and you did nothing to try to rectify the situation. Point 10, one sophomore student reported that Kohberger had followed her and told her bosses at WSU about the incident. So again, if she told her bosses at WSU that Kohberger was following her and they did nothing to do anything about it or address the situation, that's bad for the university. In response, they told her she should not be alone with Kohberger and suggested that campus security should escort her out, and commented that she was not the first to report such problems with him. That, again, massive problem for the university. If they knew people were reporting creepy behavior by Kohberger and even offered to escort them to the car and advised them to stay away from Kohberger, but other than that, did nothing to stop the behavior, could be a problem. Again, falling short of they should have been able to predict murder. But anyways, on other occasions, this sophomore's supervisor would take her home. On other occasions, this sophomore's supervisor would take her home so that she did not have to walk by herself or take public transportation, and she became concerned about all of the precautions that needed to be taken because of Kohberger's behavior. So again, if you've got somebody on the record, this person's a supervisor, that they gave them rides home to avoid her interactions with Kohberger and did nothing further to mitigate those problems, could be a problem for the university. Number 11, on more than one occasion, WSU employees would stay in a room where Kohberger was engaging with one of their colleagues out of concern that the colleague should not be left alone with him. On other occasions, a WSU employee told her colleague to email her with the subject heading of 911 if she needed help because of Kohberger. On yet another occasion, a WSU undergraduate fled into a bathroom to hide from Kohberger because she was so uncomfortable with his scary behaviors. So once again, all of this stuff is at a new level of specificity that if it's true and is documented as they're acting like it is, they're acting like, hey, look, these are things we're going to prove at trial. And that would look bad for WSU if all of these people were coming forward saying, look, this guy's creeping me out, he follows women, we need escorts to our cars because we're terrified of the guy. That would look bad. That would look bad for WSU. Now, point 12, as early as mid-September 2022, WSU professors were discussing the need to do an intervention with Kohberger. So again, that's on the record, and that's going to be bad for the university because of his treatment of female students. By September or October 2022, a WSU professor believed that Kohberger was stalking people. Again, if that's in writing, that a professor at WSU thought Kohberger was stalking girls, and it's documented, major problem for the university. One student learned that Kohberger had photos of her and other female classmates on his cell phone. That's kind of a ambiguous one on whether it's a problem or not. If Kohberger takes a picture of a classroom full of people and somebody's in that picture, doesn't mean a whole lot. So we'd have to know a lot more. But one student learned Kohberger had a photo of her and her classmates on his cell phone, and that may or may not be true, but it may also mean absolutely nothing. So we'll see. Kohberger's victims were encouraged to report his behavior. Kohberger's victims were encouraged. Whose victims? The victims that say he was stalking him with that were encouraged to report his behavior, and a number of them did. So that's important. If they were reporting to WSU and authorities that they were creeped out by his behavior and it's on their record and they did nothing or next to nothing, there could be a problem for them. The WSU Office of Compliance and Civil Rights, or the CCR, had at least 13 formal complaints related to Kohberger, yet the individual in charge of acting on those complaints later reported that she had neither met nor even spoken with Kohberger. So there you go. You've got indications that there's been 13 formal reports written up, and that's the person in charge of those write-up reports didn't speak to Kohberger about it. That is a major problem for the university, in my opinion. One student complained that she was unsatisfied with how prior reports about Kohberger had been handled, and she did not believe that WSU would adequately protect her from retaliation. But she continued to report her experiences to the program chair and other faculty, stating that Kohberger's actions made her feel unsafe. Another graduate student made complaints about Kohberger and was directed to copy them to another department at WSU, but she was reluctant to do so because she had experiences with that and bad experiences with that in the past. So some people, they're saying, had problems with Kohberger and didn't document it because they just felt it wasn't going to go anywhere. That's not going to help them if it's not documented. Point 15. One female graduate student reported that she wondered why people in power in WSU's criminal justice department did not meaningfully address Kohberger's behavior. During one of several faculty meetings where Kohberger was discussed extensively, so again, if there are documented staff meetings where Kohberger is the focus of the discussion, that is super bad for the university and super good for the family's lawsuit. During one of those several faculty meetings where Kohberger was discussed extensively, one faculty member remarked, "Mark my words, I work with predators. If we give him a PhD, that's the guy that in the many years will, when he's a professor, we will hear of harassing, stalking, and sexually abusing his students." So again, if that comment, which they quote in this document that comment, which means it sounds to me like they've got it in writing somewhere and they got an exact quote of it. If that's the case, that is big problems, in my opinion, for the university and good for the family's lawsuit. This same WSU professor believed that Kohberger was already stalking people. And again, if that's documented, that is a problem, in my opinion. I'm not a legal guy. Just do this. I just slept at a Holiday Inn, that's all. So I'm pretty good at this stuff. Anyways, point 16. Kohberger's supervising instructor, however, was concerned that removing him from employment at WSU would open the university up to a civil lawsuit from Kohberger, thereby elevating the financial interests of the university above the safety and security of students, staff, and members of the Pullman Moscow community. So that's huge, right? It's huge for the families. They're alleging that it's documented that someone was afraid that if they removed Bryan Kohberger from the program, he would sue the school. And if they're wrong about him being a predator or a danger, and they removed him and he sues them, they're going to lose money. So it was more important for them to not get sued by Kohberger than to make sure people were safe. That's the allegations. So again, strong point for them, for the families. Point 17, the WSU Police Department is intended to be a critically important bulwark when it comes to protecting students and the community from sexual harassment, stalking, and dangerous predators. However, this is big because I cover police corruption a lot. Prior to Kohberger being hired by WSU and arriving at the Pullman Moscow community, the WSU Police Department had a long, troubling, and sordid history of tolerating and, in fact, fostering inappropriate sexual behavior in its own ranks and discouraging complete and accurate reporting of such misconduct. A lot of this document is going to talk about police officers at WSU who are engaged in sexual misconduct with college students, and they would cover that up, is the allegation. And so how could you expect a department that looks the other way on sexual harassment to look into somebody who's sexually harassing people? Because they look the other way when they're doing it. All right, so that's kind of the gist of that. Point 18, in 2007, this is an example of the above paragraph. In 2007, the WSU chief of police was demoted after an internal investigation found that he had viewed inappropriate emails on his university computer, forwarded those to other WSU police, and invited them to view them. So what exactly it was, we don't know, but he had inappropriate emails, probably of a student maybe, and forwarding it to other officers to take a look at. So who knows what's in there, but it's apparently inappropriate. And in 2011, WSU was fined $80,000 by federal officials because of multiple sexual assaults that were not properly reported. WSU did not dispute the findings of the federal investigation. So federal investigators came in and basically found that WSU police were ignoring sexual assaults and just looking the other way. And so they got fined $80,000, and there was no dispute that they basically admitted that they did those things, looked the other way on sexual assaults. So it's a systemic problem at WSU is what they're trying to say. And again, that's great for the families, bad for WSU in this lawsuit. In 2022, WSU undertook an investigation of improper sexual activities by WSU police force. So WSU, the university, started to investigate WSU police involving allegations that an officer, one guy, had had sex with a victim in the presidential suite of the Martin Stadium and the WSU Observatory while on duty. So at the football stadium, he has sexual relations with some victim while he was in uniform, is what I'm believing is the case when they get into the details. And so there was an investigation done on that. And the WSU Police Department leadership did not properly report the incidents. They knew this happened with one of their officers while he was on duty in the football stadium observatory and whatever. And so the investigation ultimately found that the police department leadership exhibited gross misconduct and incompetence and neglect of duty in response to claims of sexual misconduct. So they knew an officer had done something inappropriate with the student or whatever at the football stadium and essentially did nothing about it. And there was an investigation into that. So this is a documented thing. Again, very good for the families, very bad for the university, showing a systemic problem of looking the other way, in particular with sexual crimes. Now, in August 2022, the WSU police chief, assistant chief, and the captain all resigned. 3 people resigned. WSU police chief, assistant chief, and the captain all resigned prior to facing discipline for their actions. They resigned. By the way, this is a classic thing. If you're about to go down the shithole, you just resign. You resign with your pension intact and everything intact so that you go away looking like it was your decision. That way you don't get fired, you don't lose money, you don't lose your pension, all those good things. So if you see the shitstorm coming, by the way, didn't this happen a lot in Moscow? A bunch of people retired, left immediately during the investigation and after the investigation of Bryan Kohberger and just said, I'm out, I'm going to retire before the shit hits the yes. All right. In response, WSU President Kirk Schultz issued a public statement indicating that WSU will not tolerate this kind of behavior, nor the negligence of the department command staff. So again, it was an acknowledged problem. It was an acknowledged problem by the university. This is part of the family's argument. You guys know systemic problems are going on in your police department and the way you conduct yourselves, and you've admitted it in the past that you know this is a problem, and you won't tolerate it anymore, and yet you kind of did. So that's what the family's lining up through this lawyer. Now, a subsequent investigation into the offending officer during the fall semester of 22 found that he engaged in predatory grooming behavior while in a supervisory role and had a history of sexual misconduct, and that the WSU Police Command fostered an environment that discouraged reporting sexual misconduct. So they continued to investigate the offending officer and found out he had a history of grooming people and sexual misconduct, of which they just kind of discouraged people reporting on officers for sexual misconduct, which is a major problem. Point 22. It was against the above described backdrop of WSU administrative inaction and police department dysfunction that Kohberger arrived at the Pullman Moscow community, immediately began engaging in overt harassing, stalking, and predatory behaviors, including repeatedly stalking over a period of months the 4 victims that he ultimately murdered on November 13th. This sentence has a problem for me. Bryan Kohberger repeatedly stalked over a period of months the victims at the house, even though the prosecutors in this case flat out told you there's no evidence Bryan Kohberger was stalking any of the victims. No evidence whatsoever. And yet the families will say to their attorney that categorically Bryan Kohberger was stalking the victims of the house. They've told you at the plea deal, when Kohberger was pleaded guilty, Bill Thompson told you, We don't know how he picked the house. We don't know how he picked the victims. We have no indication he was stalking the girls. There's no sexual motivation in the crime whatsoever. Everything the family is saying is not true now. Yes, there was a sexual motivation. Yes, he was stalking the girls. Yes, he did pick them. And yes, you should have saw it coming. So we're lining ourselves up with completely two different stories. Now that the plea deal's over, now all of a sudden it's a completely different story than what they told us. Subsequent forensic examination, this is point 22, of Kohberger's electronic devices revealed that he had performed many searches regarding home invasions, co-ed killings, and serial killers. Kohberger's search history revealed internet searches about psychopaths, paranoia, and porn involving exclusively non-consensual sex acts. Kohberger's search history also included search on a killer named Danny Rawling, who murdered 5 college students in Gainesville, Florida, by entering a college apartment through a sliding glass door, masked and dressed in black, and stabbed his victim to death using a K-bar knife, all features of Kohberger's later murders. By the way, in case you didn't know, I covered that. I covered that in one of my videos. Was this a copycat of the Gainesville Ripper? I asked that question. I covered it in detail. So if you haven't seen that and you're curious to see what my coverage of that was, go back and watch that as well. So we talked about this in depth, but they're pointing it out now as well. And them saying that Kohberger had deleted searches or tried to cover up searches that he had been searching for psychopaths, paranoia, non-consensual porn, like females passed out or whatever. Again, this came out on a Dateline NBC article, a news article. So do they have the proof of it, or are they just following Dateline NBC's news? That's going to be the million-dollar question. Do they have proof of it at all? Point 24. Subsequent law enforcement investigation also revealed that Kohberger had driven around the home of the murder victims in the middle of the night over a dozen times, and as early as August 2022. I don't even want to get into point 24. The ridiculousness of pinging off the cell tower that services the house at 1122 King Road residence as proof of stalking has been fought and fought and fought and fought, and even the prosecution admits there's no evidence of stalking, even though the families will continue to insist Bryan Kohberger was stalking the house because his phone pinged off the cell tower that serviced the house at 1122 King Road residence. It is an asinine loop of logic. It is a fuckery in the way that they're presenting it. But fair enough. You want to keep hanging on it. I'm going to call this the weakest part of your argument. Yeah, he was stalking the victims because his cell phone pinged off of, like everybody that drives in that town pings off the cell tower that services the house. But somehow that's proof of his stalking and not the other 20,000 people that pinged off the cell tower that services the house at 112 King Road residence, probably more than he did. You didn't say they were all stalking the girls, even though I guarantee, 100% guarantee you, a lot of other people in that neighborhood pinged off the cell tower that services the house at 1122 King Road residence way more than Bryan Kohberger. So you're not calling them stalkers, but you're calling him a stalker because in retrospect, he killed everybody. So therefore he must have been stalking them. Anyways, it's a circular logic. Point 25, despite having a formal threat assessment team, so the university had a threat assessment team, a now common practice at universities to protect or proactively identify, assess, and manage individuals who may pose a risk of violence, WSU wholly failed to follow that process with Kohberger and instead allowed the dangerous behaviors to escalate while it simultaneously continued to support him financially, provide him with access to university resources and students, and keep him housed rent-free in the Pullman Moscow community. So what they're saying is, you have procedures that are documented and we know what they are and we're going to prove it in court. You have procedures that say you're supposed to do certain things and you didn't do it. And that is a problem for WSU and a win for the family. As a result of the WSU's actions and failures, 4 young college students were brutally murdered. So that's the ending clicker. They're saying because the university didn't follow its own policies, that is the reason Kohberger was able to kill people. Therefore, if they had followed their own procedures, they would. And why am I not showing this on screen? I fucking suck. I haven't been showing this. I've been reading it to you. I've been reading it to you, not showing it to you. I told you that I got that phone call and it screwed me all up. All right. Am I going to redo this whole video? No. And then I always want to point out a couple more things here. Point 30 shows that Stacy Chapin is a citizen of the state of Washington and resident of Skagit County and the surviving mother of Ethan Chapin. That's the reason why it was filed in Skagit County, because she's the only one that actually lives in Washington state. And that's why it was filed in Skagit County, because that's where she lives. All acts and omissions of the defendant allegedly in this complaint are alleged to have been committed by agents and or employees of the defendant acting within the course or scope of their agency and or employment, including members of WSU Department of Criminal Justice, Criminology, and members of WSU Police Department and members of the WSU administration. So they're just saying we filed this in the right jurisdiction at the right time. The venue is proper, Skagit County, pursuant to the decision, and because the plaintiff, Stacey Chapin, resides in Skagit County, and the venue is proper as Skagit County because WSU has offices in Skagit County. So they're saying, hey, WSU has a branch office or whatever in Skagit County and was filed there, so this is the right place to do it. WSU will later argue, no, it really makes more sense to be on the eastern side of the state where the main school is at and where all the victims and all the people who are allegedly in the case are at. So let's move it to the eastern side of the state, not Skagit County. And I think they won that or are going to win that, in my opinion. Now, point 42, stalkers on college campuses are more likely to be acquaintances of the victims, such as classmate, friend, or someone else that they recognize. And again, while the families will put this into the document, the stalkers are more likely to be acquaintances of the victim as a classmate or friend, are failing to acknowledge or accept that the prosecution themselves stated Bryan Kohberger had no connection to any of the victims in the house. They can't find any. And they even said at the press release afterwards, we really, really wanted to find a connection between Bryan Kohberger and the girls, and we couldn't find one. They really wanted to find that connection and couldn't find it. And yet the families are going to continue to use this clever language that Bryan Kohberger was stalking the victims. And it's common that they stalk victims who they know and friends and family. Well, they're playing some fuckery. Bryan Kohberger did stalk, they say, other classmates of his, but not the ones that were murdered. Those diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder are also more likely to engage in stalking behavior. This is a little tidbit they throw in and made a lot of people angry who have family who are autistic. We'll set that aside for now. Now, this is where they get into some of the details of what the real lawsuit's about. Mandatory reporters at universities are required to report any instances of stalking. Under Washington state law, Title IX, and the Clery Act, stalking is defined as engaging in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear that the person's safety or the safety of others or suffer substantial emotional distress. A course of conduct is two or more acts. So they're saying, look, if a person says that they're creeped out by somebody's behavior and it's happened two or more times, you have rules and regulations that state you have to act on that. That's where we're going with this. Point 56, because stalking involves a pattern of behavior that often includes multiple and varied tactics, it is critical that universities promptly coordinate their response so that complaints about concerning behavior can properly and urgently be identified as stalking. Stalking behaviors often change and escalate over time, and it is therefore critical that universities document all stalking behavior, even if it appears minor. This is where they're setting up the argument. People were coming forward to you and documenting Bryan Kohberger was engaging in stalking behaviors, so if you didn't document it, you have a problem because you're required to document it. If you did document and you didn't do it, then you have another problem. So that's what they're all setting up. Point 59, WSU in particular has implemented policies and procedures designed to prohibit, prevent, and intervene in situations involving discriminatory, harassing, stalking, or predatory behavior, and to discipline its employees and students who engage in these behaviors. So a large part of this legal document is going to be breaking down all the different laws and not all the different procedures in their own handbooks and guidance that states when they are supposed to intervene when people are reporting predatory stalking type behavior, of which they're going to argue it was being reported to the university and they didn't do anything according to their own policies that they were required to do. Therefore, they are suing the university because it would have been, this is their argument, it would have been stopped. It would not have happened if they had followed their own procedures. WSU also has the ability to exercise sufficient control over its faculty, staff, and employees to manifest a duty to control their behavior. So again, because Washington State University, not University of Washington, those are two different entities, because the Washington State University has the ability to revoke your pay, to not give you free housing, to not give you free internet, because they do that, they control your behavior. They can literally take away all the things that you require to live there. And so therefore, in effect, they have control of your behavior. So therefore, they're responsible for what happened in that house that night, is the argument. It's going to be an uphill battle, I think, on that, but we'll see. WSU has policies and procedures to control the conduct and prohibit and prevent discrimination, harassment, and stalking. WSU was obligated to control Kohberger under the requirements of the employment agreement with him. Now, what they're going to do is they're going to outline all the different ways in which the university had the ability to and requirement to control Bryan Kohberger, and they did not. So number one was through his employment agreement. And then they say, under the requirements of your employment agreement, WSU was obligated to keep control of Kohberger. Under their policies, one condition of employment was that Kohberger complete a sexual misconduct declaration prior to his hire. He had to declare whether he was the subject of any findings or investigation into sexual misconduct. A failure to provide complete and accurate information in this declaration can result in WSU withdrawing their offer of employment. So, had they asked him about his previous sexual, whether he'd have any other previous sexual complaints and fully investigated that, they could have not offered him a job and therefore had control over whether or not he was able to pull off this crime. WSU also has a policy requiring pre-employment background checks. So had they done that, maybe they would have caught something. This is their counter to that, or their follow-on. Had WSU performed a comprehensive pre-employment background check on Kohberger, it likely would have revealed significant red flags and a risk of hiring Kohberger and bringing him to the Pullman-Moscow community. So they're saying, look, if you're required to do a background check, and I can't imagine that if you did do a background check, you didn't see red flags. So you either didn't do the background check, and that's why you didn't see the red flags, and you were required to do so, or you did and you ignored them. Either way, you're in deep shit. And strong point for the family. WSU was obligated to control Kohberger under the requirements of the Graduate School Policies and Procedures Manual. So this is the second thing. The first one was his employment agreement. They could have controlled him. Now they could have controlled him through the Graduate School Policies and Procedures Manual, another document that specifies how they're supposed to handle certain situations. They will point out a few things like in that. WSU policy requires all graduate teaching assistants complete the Human Resource Services discrimination, sexual harassment, and sexual misconduct prevention training. So he had to have had training in the manual talking about what kind of behaviors would be considered sexual harassment. Had he taken that training and had they followed through with making sure he understood the training, maybe this wouldn't have happened, is the argument. Here's another one. That policy that they had in place that maybe they didn't fully follow. WSU was obligated to control Kohberger under the requirements of the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology Graduate Handbook. So we've got multiple student handbooks that say you need to watch out for these things. So did you just ignore them or what? That's what they're asking. So they highlight a section here. Well, I guess we won't. That's just another policy. There you go. I'm not gonna read their examples, but that was another policy they could have held them under. Here's another one. WSU was obligated to control Kohberger under the standards of conduct for students. So we have a bunch of different procedures that deal with sexual harassment sections, including now the standards of conduct for students. And so if a WSU graduate teaching assistant is suspended or expelled as a result of a violation of the standards of conduct, their assistantship is terminated immediately. So WSU, again, could have controlled Bryan Kohberger going to school there, because if he violated the standards of conduct, and they should have found that he did, then he could be terminated immediately, and he wouldn't have been there to commit the murders, is essentially where they're going with this. A WSU representative previously testified in another lawsuit against WSU involving a student's death off campus. So listen, a WSU representative previously testified in another lawsuit against WSU involving a student death off campus that the Center for Community Standards can respond to reported violations that occur off campus if they create safety concerns or if they impact the reputation of the university negatively. So what they're saying is your own procedures say that you can get involved with student behavior when it happens off campus and on campus. And you've set a precedence that's happened before. And then another one, WSU was obligated to control Kohberger under the Executive Policy 15, another document that they say specifies EP 15 requires that all WSU employees, including student employees, have information regarding sexual harassment, must report that information to the WSU's Compliance and Civil Rights, or CCR office. Sexual harassment includes stalking. So they're saying, look, people were reporting his behavior, and you have another document that says when it's being reported, you must pass this up to the WSU's Compliance and Civil Rights, CCR office. So did you do it or did you not do it? That's a major problem. And WSU was also obligated to control Kohberger under the Executive Policy 42, which talks about threat assessment teams, or TATs. So threat assessment teams, or TATs, are now commonplace at colleges and universities throughout the United States and have become a critical part of standard of care for preventing violence on campus and in surrounding communities. So had they followed their TAT, or their threat assessment, would they have been able to stop this? Have they followed their own procedures, is what they're saying. WSU was also, you got a million ways that WSU failed. WSU was also obligated to control Kohberger under its waiver 20, or WAVR 21 threat assessment and intervention protocols. So that has some language specifying WAVR 21 recommends that when removing such problematic individuals from a program, the organization should offer supportive services and careful messaging to reduce the risk of an individual committing violence. Mishandling complaints about a problematic individual can also contribute to them committing violence. Where's that going? What they're saying is Bryan Kohberger had been hauled into a couple disciplinary meetings about his behavior towards female students. That may have been done improperly, and they aggravated him to commit violence. You're humiliating him. You're challenging him. You're making him angry. And because you didn't do it right, and your policies state you have to do it right, not only do you have to address it, but you have to address it right, because if you don't address it right, your own policy says that can cause anger and violence. Therefore, you may have addressed Kohberger in some situations, but all you did is you made him angry, therefore causing him to go commit murder, and it's your fault he killed somebody, is essentially what they're trying to say. WAVR 21 warns that in a campus setting, problematic individuals are most likely to become violent in the days following a shameful or rejecting event, such as a reprimand, or even though they may have fantasized about mass killings for weeks or months. So they're saying again, look, if you shamed or reprimanded Bryan Kohberger shortly before the murders, then you may be complicit in actually being part of the reason why he murdered people. You didn't follow your own procedures. You shamed him. You made him basically, you pushed him over the edge. And so that's why he committed the murders. So therefore it's your fault, or you should have stopped it. And WAV, and again, the bottom line is the reason why you want to make it their fault is because they're the one with the money, right? Kohberger doesn't have any money. He can't fight. He can't give them $500 million, but the university has deep, deep pockets. So if you can make it somebody else's fault that has money, that's where you go after them. And that's why you set the precedence. Somebody needs to be held accountable, i.e. someone needs to pay up, bitch, like $500 million. That's what we're going after, because you have the pockets. So I'm going to make it your problem. Anyways. WAVR 21 emphasizes that there's a tendency in academia to not fully vet faculty or graduate level applicants for conduct or criminal history, and that has contributed to dire consequences. So again, their own documentation says when you don't do this properly, it has dire consequences. According to WAVR 21, one risk factor for violence is an individual that has a strong desire for intimacy, but unable to obtain it because of his own deficiencies and being unable to connect with others. So again, here comes the incel thing. And we're going to mention, they mention incel in here later on. Bryan Kohberger couldn't get laid, and therefore his failures of inadequacy were accentuated when you basically reprimanded him and made him feel even more of a failure because he can't make it with women. Despite the fact that Bryan Kohberger had a girlfriend, and despite the fact that a girl was slept over at his house, and despite the fact that multiple females gave him a phone number, all that shit's come out. But we're going to still go with the logic that he's a loser and can't get laid, and that because he felt inadequate, he had to kill people, and you pushed him over the edge because he was inadequate with women. Waiver 21 further warns that autism spectrum disorder is a risk factor for young perpetrators of mass murder due to their strong desire for but inability to establish intimate or social bonds. Well, so anyways, autism spectrum disorder makes it hard for you sometimes to connect with people. And so that apparently makes you more likely to commit violence because you're at to lash out for somebody at your inability to make friends and influence people. And WAVR 21 warns that an individual who displays anger that causes fear in others is also an indicator of potential violence. So we already have, they said, a documented event where Kohberger became so angry at somebody that they had to leave the room in tears because he made them angry, and multiple people supposedly saw that he had made them very angry, and he himself appeared angry. Therefore, your own documents in this particular WAVR 21, sorry, my nose itches, tells you that if somebody shows anger and intimidates people through anger, they're more likely to commit violence. So you should have saw it coming. It's in your own procedures, and you didn't stop it. So therefore, it's your fault. Waiver 21 warns that a specific indicator of dangerous level of anger is when an individual engages physically threatening or intimidating movement or gestures, such as standing too close to someone or glaring at them. So again, they got all this documented behavior that Bryan Kohberger stood too close. Don't stand so close to me. Yeah, I go back to pop reference things right in the middle of fucking something serious. It's what I do. It's part of my thing. All right. So again, autism spectrum disorder is notorious for people who are on the spectrum, don't necessarily have verbal cues or nonverbal cues like you and I. They don't understand when you're standing too close to you or they're making you feel uncomfortable. That's just part of that condition, and it doesn't make you a killer. But they're going to try to say, yeah, those kind of things are also those kind of things that future killers do. Many stalkers have a criminal history and a history of drug abuse and psychiatric. So here again, we go back to Bryan Kohberger was using drugs when he was a teenager. So therefore, he's a drug user and has psychiatric issues like autism, and therefore that made him more likely to be a killer. And you should have saw it coming. Stalkers also tend to be highly intelligent. So again, because he's smart in the PhD program, they should have realized that was also a contributing factor to him likely being a killer because he's smart, going to their university. So they should have saw that coming. Anyways, and so it contributes to their resourcefulness and manipulativeness in their activities. According to the WAVR 21, stalkers' motives generally stem from a need to control or instill fear in a victim as a means to overcome intolerable feelings of inadequacy or humiliation, to increase feelings of omnipotence, or to retaliate against a perceived injustice. Erotomania, or delusional belief that a person is infatuated with the perpetrator despite distinct objective evidence to the contrary, is another characteristic of stalkers. I don't know where they got the idea that Bryan Kohberger suffers from erotomania, the delusional belief that a person's infatuated with him. I don't know where they got that idea, but they're laying it out, so they must have something that they're planning on showing in the documents. I find that interesting. WAVR 21 also warns that the perpetrator may target victims in an off-campus setting. So there you go. Their own procedures, according to them, show that they should have been watching for him attacking somebody off campus. In the WAVR 21 assessment, one significant red flag is whether the individual shows a general preoccupation with violent ideas, fantasies, or identification or fixation with perpetrators of violence or mass murders. So again, they point out that he was studying serial killers like Rawlings that we talked about earlier and Ted Bundy. And so therefore his fascination with violence and mass murder, despite the fact that he's a criminology student and that's what he's going into, shows that he had all the warning signs of becoming a violent predator. A WAVR 21 warns that an individual on a pathway to violence may show an unusual interest in notorious perpetrators. So again, because he was interested in serial killers, that means that should have been a warning sign to them, even though he was going into criminology. All right. So WSU was obligated to control Kohberger under the terms of the WSU's family and graduate apartment agreement. They're still going on all the reasons. This whole document is all the reasons in which they had a responsibility to stop Bryan Kohberger from killing people, and they didn't. They had procedures that could have stopped it had they followed their own procedures. That's the whole gist of this document. One of the amenities the WSU provided to Kohberger as a part of the apartment agreement was free internet access, both wired and wireless. That internet access basically talks about how there is some information that's available that may contain language or images about subjects intended for adult audiences. Some of the information available over the internet may even be illegal or transmit or possess. Examples include, but are not limited to, child pornography, illegal export of software, blah, blah, blah. I don't know why they're putting that in there. Nobody accused Bryan Kohberger of trafficking child pornography. But anyways, they're putting it in how the university, had control of his internet usage. So if he was using the internet to search things like violent rapes and crimes, they're saying that they should have shut that down because they have procedures that say you can't use our internet service to do things inappropriate. The apartment agreement states that inappropriate use of computers on WSU provided network can result in the loss of network privileges. WSU also retains the right to monitor your usage, and WSU retains the right to terminate access to their network. So they're kind of setting up that Bryan Kohberger did some of these searches for inappropriate porn while at work on school computers on their internet service, and they should have seen he was doing that, and therefore they should have caught it and stopped him from doing it and fired him or taken away his internet access for looking at pornography and stuff like that on school resources. And the apartment agreement also prohibited Kohberger from possessing any weapons, including knives, in his apartment. Well, you can't prove he did have a knife in his apartment. That's the part that's the catch-22. They're claiming because he killed people with a knife, therefore it means the knife was at his apartment, and the rules say you're not allowed to have a knife in your apartment. Therefore, they should, by the way, it says, they have the right to enter Kohberger's apartment and at any reasonable hour for the purpose of inspection. So they should have been randomly searching his apartment to see if he has a knife today, and that would have been able to stop the murders. That's a fucking huge reach, the way I read it. You have a policy against knives. He killed people with a knife, so therefore at some point the knife had to be in the apartment. You haven't proven that. And therefore, if you had done random inspections of the apartment, you might have caught the knife in there and could have stopped the murder. That is an asinine logic loop, but that's what it seems like they're trying to lay out. All right, let's kind of wrap up because this is super, super long, and I'm only 40 pages in. I'm wordy bastard. There's a couple things I wanted to really get to, and I haven't got to it. When Kohberger arrived at WSU in the fall of 22, the WSU Police Department was consumed by investigating its long and sordid history of tolerating and, in fact, fostering serious sexual misconduct in its own ranks. And I told you before, a lot of this is repeated information. So they talk about, again, the scandal involving officers. There's more details. It is interesting. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to skip that. There's a lot of stuff in there. I wanted to get to maybe one more point. There's some really good stuff in there. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kind of wrap it up here because there's too good of stuff and I don't want to pass it up. There is really good stuff about what exactly the officer said in relation to female students and stuff like that. But I wanted to get this document started, this legal breakdown of the WSU document, the lawsuit against WSU by the families, to say, look, here's the bottom line. So far in the 40 pages I've read, the document has teeth. It has merit. It's got some strong things. Their argument that WSU had a responsibility to have stopped this in some regard has more weight to it than it looks like on the surface, right? Because again, they pointed out at least 8, maybe 10 different procedures that state how and how they could monitor for red flags. Did they follow those procedures? And if they had followed their own procedures, would they have been able to stop what happened in Idaho 4? Now, all of that, of course, is if Bryan Kohberger really did it and did it alone. That's a whole nother thing. And there's some surprises coming up on that as well. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this. It's a little lengthy with no real conclusion other than that's part 1. So I'm going to call this part 1 of the WSU lawsuit breakdown to give you my thoughts. We'll get into some more details again on some of that. We'll go ahead and look into some of those details about what the officers had done and how they looked the other way. And then some surprising details about Kohberger's scratches, apparently the day after or within days after the murders. Scratches that I'm not sure a lot of people have heard about. Certainly didn't see on the selfie picture of him thumbs upping from the shower. There's a talk later on we're going to find about a giant scratch on his face. Did you see that on the selfie picture in the shower? I didn't. But anyways, this is just part 1 of that legal document. And for what it's worth, I will say this to be fair with the story. The lawsuit against WSU is stronger than a lot of people realize. The families may have a good suit in a lot of ways if they can prove half the stuff that they say that they can prove. So we'll see how it goes. I'll break down the rest of their document, where the holes are, in my opinion, and where the strong points are in part 2. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe. Have a good day.